I'm glad you're here. Well, I mean, it's nice having people to the house. Sometimes. No, I mean like today, this beautiful afternoon. But I invited you here because I wanted to get your opinion about something. Some of you know I've been working on my autobiography, and as usual, I find myself digressing a great deal on one particular subject. And I got to wondering if I shouldn't publish a few of these chapters as a separate book. Well, let me share my notes with you and see what you think. Let's see. This goes way back. When I was a Sunday school scholar, something more than 60 years ago, I became interested in Satan. I wanted to find out all I could about him. And I began asking questions. But my class teacher, Mr. Barclay, was reluctant about answering them, it seemed to me. I was anxious to be praised for turning my thoughts to serious subjects, when there wasn't another boy in the village who could be hired to do such a thing. I was greatly interested in the story of Eve. You too? You notice all the men went, I mean, Eve and the serpent. And I thought Eve's calmness was perfectly noble. And I remember asking Mr. Barclay if he knew of any other woman who, being approached by a talking serpent, wouldn't excuse herself and break for the nearest timber. He wouldn't answer my question. No, he rebuked me for inquiring into matters above my age and comprehension. I will say for Mr. Barclay that he was willing to tell me the facts of Satan's history, but he stopped there. He wouldn't allow any discussion of them. And in the course of time, we exhausted the facts. There are only 5 or 6 of them, as you probably know. Well, look it up. Oh no, you could set them all down on a visiting card. Well, I was disappointed. I'd been planning on writing a biography of Satan, and said as much. I was grieved to find that there were no materials, and I told Mr. Barclay this with the tears running down. Well, his sympathies and compassion were aroused, for he was a kind and gentle-hearted spirit, and he patted me on the head and cheered me up by saying there was a whole vast ocean of materials. I can still feel that happy thrill which those words shot through me. And then he began to bail out those riches from that ocean for my encouragement and joy. Like this. it was conjectured, but not established, that Satan was once an angel up in heaven, that he fell and he rebelled and brought on a war, that he was defeated and banished to perdition. Also, we have reason to believe that later on he did so-and-so. And we are warranted in supposing that he subsequently traveled extensively, seeking whom he might devour. And a couple of centuries later, as tradition instructs us, he took to the cruel trade of tempting people to their ruin with vast and fearful results. And that by and by, as the probabilities seem to indicate, he may have done certain things. He might have done certain other things. And he must have done still other things. And so on and so on. We set down the 5 known facts by themselves on a piece of paper and numbered it page 1. And then on 1,500 other pieces of paper, we set down all the conjectures and maybes and guesses and likelihoods and probabilities and rumors. And we are permitted to thinks, and we are warranted in believings, and must-have-beens, and unquestionablys, and without a shadow of a doubt. And behold, materials, why, we had enough to build a biography of Shakespeare. But he made me put away my pen. You know, he would not allow me to write the history of Satan. Why? Well, because, as he put it, he had suspicions. Suspicions that my attitude in the matter was not reverent. And that a person must be reverent when writing about the sacred characters. And he said anyone who spoke flippantly about Satan would be frowned on by the religious world and also be brought up to account. Well, I assured him in earnest and sincere words that I had the highest respect for Satan, that my reverence for him equaled or possibly exceeded any other member of any other church. And I said it wounded me deeply to perceive by his words that he thought I would try to make fun of him or deride him, laugh at him, scoff at him. Whereas, in fact, I had never thought of such a thing. But I did have a warm desire to make fun of those others and laugh at them. What others? Why, those supposers and perhapsers and might-have-beenners and must-have-beenners and could-have-beenners and without a shadow of a doubters, and we are warranted in believingers, and that whole funny crop of solemn architects who had taken a good solid foundation of 5 indisputable and unimportant facts and built upon it a conjectural Satan 30 miles high. And what did Mr. Barclay do then? Was he disarmed? Was he silenced? No. He was shocked. He was so shocked he visibly shuddered. And he said, why, those satanic traditioners and perhapsers and conjecturers were themselves sacred as their work. So sacred that whosoever wants to mock them or make fun of their work would never afterward enter any respectable house, even by the back door. How true were his words, and how wise, and how fortunate it would have been for me if I had heeded them. But I was young, and I was only 7 years of age, and vain and foolish and anxious for attention. I wrote the biography and have never been in a respectable house since. How curious and interesting is the parallel as far as poverty of biographical details is concerned between Satan and Shakespeare. I mean, it is wonderful, it is unique, it stands quite alone. There's nothing resembling it in history, nothing resembling it in romance, nothing approaching it even in tradition, and yet how sublime is their position, how overtopping and sky-reaching, supreme. The two great unknowns, the two illustrious conjecturabilities, are they the best known unknown persons that have ever drawn a breath on this planet. For the instruction of the ignorant. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look at you when I said that. That was unkind. I meant to look at him. No, let's just say, for the instruction of the ignorant, wherever you are, whoever you are, and you know who you are. I will list now the details of Shakespeare's history, which are facts, verified facts, established facts, undisputed facts. This is all backed up by documentary evidence, what they call hard evidence. It's a very rare book. William Shakespeare. Fact. He was born on the 23rd of April, 1564. For those of you taking notes over here. I don't see any pens wiggling, but that's right, I assume you're sponging this all up, okay? Of good farmer class parents, that means peasants, who could not read, could not write, could not sign their names. At Stratford-upon-Avon in England, a small back settlement north of London, which in those days was shabby and unclean and densely illiterate. For instance, of the 19 important men charged with the government of the town, 13 had to make their mark in attesting important documents because they could not write their names. Now, of the first 18 years of William's life, nothing is known. They are a blank. That makes note-taking a lot easier. But on the 27th of November, 1582, William Shakespeare, he never spelled his name Shakespeare. Don't know if you know that. He took out a license to marry Anne Whatley. Next day, he took out a license to marry Anne Hathaway. And she was 8 years his senior. He married Anne Hathaway in a hurry. You guessed it. Don't get ahead of me now. Within 6 months, the first child was born. You do the math. Well, about 2 blank years followed, during which period nothing at all happened to Shakespeare, as far as anybody knows. Then came twins, 1585, February, on a Tuesday. No, I just added that. 2 blank years follow. This is getting easier all the time. Then in 1587, he makes a 10-year visit to London, leaving the family behind. 5 blank years follow. And during this period, nothing happened to him as far as anybody actually knows. We're moving right along here. Then, 1592, there is mention of him as an actor. And the next year, 1593, his name appears in a list of players. Moving up. Next year, 1594, he played before Queen Elizabeth. No wonder they called her the Virgin Queen. But playing before the Queen was a detail of no consequence. Other obscurities did it every year of the 45 years of her reign and remained obscure. But 3 pretty full years follow, full of play acting. And then in 1597, he bought a house in Stratford, his old hometown. So he was doing all right. We'll skip a little here, and 13 or 14 busy years follow, in which he accumulated money, they don't say how, and further reputation as an actor and theater manager. Some of you probably know that's the original Globe Theatre in London, and there is evidence that he was a co-investor. That's all we know. Meantime, his name, liberally and variously spelt, sometimes with an X, Shax, sometimes with a U, Spur. Did you think I was going to say shucks? His name had become associated with a great many plays and poems, and as ostensibly the author. Some of these were pirated. It means published without his name. And he made no protest. Then in 1610, he returned to Stratford and settled down for good and all. And busied himself, it says here, with lending money, trading in grain and land and houses. You never thought about it this way, did you? Shirking a debt of 41 shillings borrowed by his wife during his long desertion of the family, suing debtors for shillings and coppers. That'd be like dimes and pennies to us. And being sued himself for shillings and coppers. Well, he lived 5 or 6 more years until 1616 in the joy of these elevated pursuits. And then he wrote a will. A thorough businessman's will. He didn't write it, his lawyer did. But it named in minute detail every item of property he owned in the world. Every land, houses, a sword, a silver gilt bowl, and so on. All the way down to his second best bed. That's what it says. Now this will carefully and calculatingly distributed his riches among the members of his family, leaving no individual out of it. Not even his wife. Remember his wife? The wife he married in a hurry before he was 19. The wife he had left husbandless for so many years. The wife who had to borrow 41 shillings in her need, which the lender was never able to collect. That wife? No, even this wife was remembered in Shakespeare's will. He left her that second best bed and not another thing. Not a penny to bless her lucky widowhood with. Now, the will mentioned not a single book. Now, books were much more precious than swords and silver gilt bowls and second best beds in those days. I mean, Gutenberg was just barely gone. And when a departing person owned a book, he gave it a high place in his will. Not Shakespeare. The will mentioned not a book, not a play, not a poem, not an unfinished work, not a scrap of manuscript of any kind. Many poets have died poor, but this is the first one in history who's ever died this poor. The others all left literary remains behind, writings. If Shakespeare had owned a dog, well, we won't go into that. I mean, we know he would have mentioned it in his will. It was that thorough. If a good dog, his daughter Susanna would have got it. If an inferior one, yeah, his wife might have got a dour interest in it. I wish he'd had a dog. It's just so he could see how painstakingly he divided it among his family. Now, he signed the will in 3 places. There they are, if you can read them. That's his actual signature. And he signed a few other official documents, you know, from all those court cases. And these 5 or 6 signatures still exist. And they're so proud to show them to you in the archives in London. There are no other specimens of his penmanship in existence. Not a line. I mean, was he prejudiced against the art or something? So far as anybody knows and can actually prove, William Shakespeare never wrote a play in his life. So far as anybody knows and can prove, he never wrote a letter in his life. No one says, hey, I got this letter. So far as anyone knows, he received only 1 letter during his life. I'm just not so sure he could read it. But so far as anyone knows and can actually prove, Shakespeare of Stratford wrote only 1 poem during his lifetime. And this is it. This is authentic. He did write that. This fact is undisputed. And he wrote the whole of it. All 4 lines. He wrote the whole of it out of his own head. And he commanded that this work of art be engraved on his tomb. And he was obeyed. And there it abides to this day. And you can go there and see it. I did. And this is it. That's right, I'll read it to you. We don't want chaos here. I studied English. It says, good friend, for Jesus' sake, that's Jesus with an I, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be ye man that spares these stones, and cursed be he yet moves my bones. He was probably dead when he wrote it. Now, in this list will be found every positively known fact of Shakespeare's life. Lean and meager as the invoice is. Beyond these details, we know not a thing about him. All the rest of his vast history, as furnished by the biographers, is built up course upon course of guesses, inferences, theories, conjectures. An Eiffel Tower of artificialities, rising sky high from a very flat and very thin foundation of inconsequential facts. Let me show you something. Here's one of the biographies right here. There are thousands of these. I won't read the whole thing to you. If you're good. But we have locked the doors, I just want you to know. In case. No, I just picked out a few passages in here that will give you an idea of what the historians and scholars and biographers and experts and authorities can do with a handful of facts. We'll jump to his boyhood here. The very small print. That doesn't help. The historians suppose that Shakespeare went to the elementary school in Stratford from the time he was 7 years old till he was 13. There is no evidence that he ever went to school at all. There's no school record. And by the way, that is not a portrait of Shakespeare. I heard somebody go, "Oh, isn't that cute?" No, that's what's called an artist's conception of what he might have looked like at that age. There are no pictures of him made during his lifetime. Not one, not, of course there were no photographs 400, 500 years ago, but there are no drawings, no paintings, no sculptures. All those were done many, many years after he died. Nobody knows what Shakespeare actually looked like. But he is kind of cute. Now, the historians infer that he got his Latin in this school, the school they suppose he attended. And they suppose his father's declining business fortunes made it necessary for him to leave the school they suppose he attended, even though there's no evidence that he ever entered or retired from the school they suppose he attended. Thank you. Can I get an amen? Amen. What a good group. They suppose that he assisted his father in the butchering business. But being just a boy, he didn't have to do full-grown butchering. No, he only slaughtered calves. And they say that whenever he killed a calf, he made a high-flown speech over it. To be or not to be, that is the question. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. Now, this supposition rests on the testimony of a man who wasn't there at the time, but who says he got it from a man who could have been there, but never said whether he was or not. And neither of them even thought to mention it until decades after Shakespeare's death. Until, old age and mental decay had refreshed and vivified their memories. The historians find themselves justified in believing, you getting the trick? That the young Shakespeare poached upon Sir Thomas Lucy's deer preserves. He killed one of his deer and was hailed off before that magistrate for it. See, that's all you have to do is suppose something, write it down, get somebody to illustrate it, publish it, and it becomes a fact. Relied on by thousands and thousands of scholars from then on. They all feed on each other. But there is no shred of trustworthy evidence that anything of the kind ever happened. Result? The young Shakespeare was a wild, oh, such a wild young scamp. And that gratuitous slander is established for all time. I mean, it's just the very way that Professor Osborne and I built the colossal skeleton brontosaur that stands 57 feet long and 16 feet high in the Natural History Museum. The awe and admiration of all the world. The stateliest skeleton on the planet. The truth is, we had 9 bones. And we built the rest of him out of plaster of Paris. We ran short of plaster of Paris. Or we could have built a brontosaur that could have sat down next to the Stratford Shakespeare, and none but an expert could tell which was the biggest. Or contained the most plaster. Now, don't be fooled. I just included this for a little point. Nobody knows who that is, or who painted it, or when. But somebody found this painting, and it looked old, and somebody thought, you know, that looks a lot like Shakespeare might have looked as a young man. And son of a gun, it's on the cover of dozens of plays and biographies of Shakespeare. Caveat emptor. I don't even know what that means. Now, how could Shakespeare possibly have become William Shakespeare? I mean, if he began slaughtering calves and poaching deer and rollicking around and learning English at the earliest likely moment, say at 13, you know, when he was supposedly wrenched from that supposable school where he was supposedly storing up Latin for supposable future literary use, he had his youthful hands full, and much more than full. He must have had to put aside his Warwickshire dialect, which would not have been understood in London. Bless you. And, but these conjecturers say he accomplished all this and more, much more. Learned law and its intricacies, and the complex procedure of law courts, because that's in the plays, and all about soldiering and sailoring, and about royal courts and aristocratic societies. That's in all the plays. And likewise accumulated in his one head all the knowledge that the learned then possessed. And all the humble knowledge of the lowly and the ignorant, because that's all in the plays. And added thereto a wider and more intimate knowledge of all the world's great literature, ancient and modern, than any man possessed in his time. That's all in the plays. Because he was going to make brilliant and easy and admiration compelling use of these splendid treasures the moment he got to London. And according to the surmisers, that is what he did. Yes. Although there was no one in Stratford who could have taught him any of these things. And no library in the little village to dig him out of. Now, according to the biographers, the young Shakespeare got his vast knowledge of the law and the law courts and lawyer talk and lawyer ways through being, for a time, a clerk in a Stratford court. Or a clerk, as they would have said. Makes sense. Just as a bright young lad like me, raised on the banks of the Mississippi River, might become perfect in knowledge about the Bering Strait whale fishery business by catching catfish with a trot line Sundays. But this surmise is damaged by the fact that there is no evidence that he ever served as a clerk in a law court. So, to cover this, they surmise that young Shakespeare accumulated his vast law treasures in the first years of his sojourn in London by, and I quote, amusing himself by learning book law in his garret, his attic apartment, and by picking up lawyer talk and the rest of it by loitering around the law courts and listening. But it is only surmise. There is no evidence that he ever did either of these things. These are just a couple of chunks of plaster of Paris. Now, there's a legend that he earned his bread and butter, made his living, by holding horses in front of the London theaters, mornings and afternoons. Maybe he did. If he did, it seriously shortened his law study hours and his recreation time in the courts. And as they say, at these times he was busy writing plays and needed all the time he could get. Now, this horse-holding legend ought to be strangled. Well, I mean, it just too formidably increases the historian's difficulty in accounting for Shakespeare's erudition, his smarts. And erudition, they say, he was still acquiring hunk by hunk and chunk by chunk every day in those strenuous times. And then emptying each day's catch into next day's imperishable drama. Now, how did he acquire these vast riches? In the usual way, by surmise. It is surmised that he traveled in Italy and Germany and all around Europe and qualified himself to put their scenic and social aspects on paper. That's in all his plays. And that he perfected himself in French and Italian and Spanish on the road. That's in his plays. And that he went to war as a soldier or sutler or something for several months or years or whatever length of time a surmiser needs in his line of business. I don't know. Maybe he did all these things. But I'd like to know who held the horses in the meantime? And who read all those books in the garret? And who frolicked in the law courts for recreation? Also, Who did all the damn play acting? Pardon my language, I'm sorry. I won't let that happen again. If my wife Livy could hear me now. Well, just for fun, let's skip to his death. When Shakespeare died in 1616, over 30 great literary productions attributed to him as author had been before the London world and held in high favor for 24 years. Yet his death was not an event in London. It made no stir. It attracted no attention. Apparently, his eminent literary contemporaries, his buddies, didn't happen to notice that their celebrated poet had passed away from their midst. His death was not even an event in his hometown of Stratford. Now, does this mean that he was not regarded as a celebrity of any kind? Apparently not. For everyone soon forgot to remember any contact with him or any incidents connected with him. Why didn't the Inquirer, the reporter, hunt them up and interview them and ask them, tell us about Shakespeare? Wasn't it worthwhile? Wasn't the matter of sufficient consequence? Did the reporter have a previous engagement to see a dog fight and couldn't spare the time? It's a striking difference with what happened to Ben Jonson and Francis Bacon and Edmund Spenser and Walter Raleigh and the other distinguished literary folk of Shakespeare's time. They were all given royal tributes, week-long celebrations, parades, songs and poems were written and published about. They were all buried in Westminster Abbey with the kings and the queens. Not Shakespeare. Ben Jonson was dubbed the poet laureate of England by the Queen. Not Shakespeare. Poof! When I examine my own case, well, that would be a little self-serving, but no, let's do that. Let's compare. I'm a celebrated author. I know what, I don't mean to boast, but I've been a celebrated author most of my life. I just got this, there I am on the cover of Harper's Weekly. That's documentary evidence right there. 20 years ago, they put me on the cover of that box of cigars. Tells you something. Let's just see what might be likely to result, most likely to result, substantially sure to result in the case of a celebrated person, a benefactor of the human race, like me. Let's see. I was born in 1835 with the name of Samuel Clemens. That was my real name. You can call me Sam. And my parents brought me to the little river town of Hannibal, Missouri when I was 2.5 years old. And I entered school at the age of 5, and I drifted from school to school. But at the age of 12, I had to learn that my father died and left our family in extremely straitened circumstances. And so my school education came to a standstill forever. And I had to go to work. I became a printer's apprentice. And that's me. That's what I looked like then. That's a tintype of me. That's the real me. That's not an artist's conception. Well, I was pretty cute, too. Anyway, I lived there in Hannibal for another 15 and a half years, and then I ran away. According to the custom of persons who are intended to become celebrated. And I bounced around the country. I didn't live there anymore. But 4 years later, my boyhood dream came true. I became a cub pilot on a Mississippi steamboat in the St. Louis to New Orleans trade. And after about a year and a half of hard work and hard study and a hard examination to get my pilot's license, I knew every inch of the Mississippi River. 1,300 miles in the dark and in the day, as well as a baby knows the way to his mother's. There are children present. Milk. Anyway, about a year later, my pilot master, Bixby, transferred me from his own steamboat over to another one called the Pennsylvania and placed me under the orders and instructions of George Ealer, one of the great, great pilots. Dead now these many, many years. And I steered for him for a good many months. Steered the daylight watch. Spun the wheel under the severe superintendence and correction of the master. Old Ealer. He was a prime chess player and an idolater of Shakespeare. Oh yeah, he would play chess with anybody, even with me. And it cost his official dignity something to do that. But also, quite uninvited, he would read Shakespeare to me. And not just casually, but by the hour, when it was his watch and I was steering. He read well, but not profitably for me, because he constantly injected commands into the text, and that broke it all up. So much so that if we were in a particularly risky and dangerous piece of river, a bystander couldn't tell sometimes which observations were Shakespeare's and which were Ealer's. I'll show you what I mean. What man dare, I dare. Approach thou. What are you laying in the leads for? What a hell of an idea. Like the rugged, ease her off a little, ease her off. Rugged Russian bear, or the armed rhinoceros, or the... There she goes, meet her, meet her! Didn't you know she'd smell that reef if you'd pulled in too close? Hurricane tiger. Take any shape but that. My firm nerves. She'll be in the woods first thing you know. Stop the starboard. Come ahead on the larboard. Back up the starboard. Now you're all right. Now come ahead on the starboard. Straighten up and go along. Never tremble. Or be alive again and dare me to the desert. Damnation, can't you keep her out of that greasy water? Pull her down, snatch her bald-headed with thy sword. If trembling I inhabit the, now you can put out the leads. No, not the starboard ones, the other ones. Protest me, the baby of a girl. Hence, horrible shadow. 8 bells, that watchman's late again, I reckon. Go down and get brown yourself. Unreal mockery. Hence! He certainly was a good reader. And splendidly thrilling and stormy and tragic. But it was a damage to me, because I've never since been able to read Shakespeare in a calm and sane way. I cannot rid it of his explosive interlardings. No, when I read Shakespeare now, I can still hear them as plainly as I did in that long departed time, 51 years ago. He didn't use the book. He didn't need to. No, he knew his Shakespeare as well as Euclid knew his multiplication tables. But I had read a book way back in that ancient day, the first one that questioned the authorship of Shakespeare's works. And then the thing happened, which has happened to more persons than to me, but I went over to the other side. And did he have something to say about it? This Shakespeare-adoring Mississippi pilot? Yes, he did, and he said it. We discussed and discussed and discussed, and disputed and disputed and disputed. At any rate, he did. And I got a word in now and then when he slipped a cog and there was a vacancy. He did his arguing with heat, with energy and violence. And I did mine with the respect and modesty of a subordinate who did not like to be flung out of the pilot house window. Perched 40 feet above the water. Oh, he was fiercely loyal to Shakespeare. But I got the best of him. Only once. I prepared myself. And then one day, when an unrisky opportunity offered itself, I brought up my pet position, my pet argument, to wit, that Shakespeare couldn't have written Shakespeare's works, for the reason that the man who wrote them knew all about law and law courts and law proceedings and lawyer talk and lawyer ways. And if Shakespeare was possessed of that vast treasure, how did he get it? And where and when? From books. From books. That was always the idea. I answered him as my readings of the champions of my side of the great controversy had taught me to answer, that a man can't handle glibly and easily and comfortably and successfully the argot, the special language of a trade in which he is not served. You know that. He'll make mistakes. He cannot and will not not get the trade phrasings precisely and exactly right, and if he departs from it by even a shade, the reader who has served in that trade will know that the writer hasn't. Besides, there were very few books in that time anyway. And only the well-to-do and highly educated possessed them. They being mostly confined to the dead languages. The few that existed were in the Latin tongue, mainly. It was a triumph for me. He was silent for a while. I knew what was happening. He was losing his temper. And I also knew he would close our sessions with the same old argument that was always his stay and his support in a time of need. The same old argument, the argument I couldn't answer because I dasn't. The argument that I was an ass and better shut up. And he delivered it and I obeyed. Oh dear, how long ago that was. How pathetically long ago. And here I am, old, forsaken, forlorn, alone, arranging to get that argument out of somebody else. What fools we mortals be. You all warm enough? Was the author of Shakespeare's works a lawyer? I mean a lawyer deeply read and immensely experienced? That is the question. And this question is so strong, so direct, so uncheapened, unwatered by maybes and guesses and supposes and might-have-beens and could-have-beens and must-have-beens and the rest of that ton of plaster of Paris out of which the biographers have constructed their colossal brontosaur and given the Stratford actor's name, that it quite convinces me that the man who wrote Shakespeare's works knew all about law and lawyers. Also, that that man couldn't have been the Stratford actor and wasn't. Let me tell you about this. That's his monument at Stratford. And this is authentic. There were no photographs, but they had an expert artist do a rendering of it. This was considered excellent reproduction. It was published in some books. It was drawn years after Shakespeare died. But I want you to notice something. Take a look at that mustache. It hangs down, like mine. Now, what's that he's leaning on there? It looks like a giant bag of grain or something, doesn't it? Now, here's what that same monument looks like today. What happened to the mustache? It turns up. And what's he leaning on? It's a flat sort of decorator's pillow. And somebody put a piece of paper and a quill pen in his hands. Who did that? And when? And why? Now, Shakespeare died young. He was only 52. And nobody in London or elsewhere noticed it, as I say. It all seems to indicate that he never had any literary celebrity there or elsewhere. And no special prominence as an actor or a manager. Now, I am way along in years. Remember we were going to compare? My 73rd birthday is well behind me. And yet, 16 of my Hannibal schoolmates are still alive and can tell and do tell inquirers dozens and dozens of adventures with their young lives in mind together. Things that happened to us in the morning of our lives, the blossom of our youth, in the dear days, the good days. Long, long ago. Long ago. I didn't want to leave that unfinished. And on the few surviving steamboats, very few, there are still 2 or 3 pilots who remember me and can tell creditable things about me from half a century ago, and a couple of white-haired engineers, and several roustabouts and mates, and a couple of deckhands who used to heave the lead for me to measure the depth of the water, and who used to sing out in the still night air, 6 feet scant, which gave me a shudder, because that meant danger, shallow water. Or Mark Twain, which took the shudder away. That meant safe water, 2 fathoms deep, and gave me a name. That's a true story. They remember me, and so do printers I worked for when I was a teenager from St. Louis to New York, and so do newspaper reporters I worked with from Nevada to San Francisco. They remember me, and they can tell stories, and so do the police. We'll just leave that alone. But if Shakespeare was really a celebrity, like me, Stratford could have told things about him. And if my experience is worth anything, they'd have done it. Now, am I trying to convince anyone that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's works? No. Now, what do you take me for? Would I be as soft-headed as that? After knowing the human race for almost 74 years? Now, I'm aware that even the best, most brilliant mind, when he's raised up from childhood believing in a superstition of any kind, it will be impossible for him, for that same mind in its maturity, to doubt the validity of that superstition. I doubt if I could do it myself. We all get it secondhand, our notions of systems of government and codes of honor and codes of morals and our beliefs in the nature of cats. I just saw one in the window. No, but you know what I mean. Our preferences in religion and political parties, we get that all secondhand. We reason none of it for ourselves. It's just the way we're made. We can't help it. We can't change it. And when we're furnished with a fetish and taught to believe in it and love it and worship it and refrain from examining it, there's no evidence, however strong or clear, that will persuade us to withdraw from it our loyalty and devotion. No, I have no idea that Shakespeare is going to have to vacate his pedestal until this side of the year 2209. Now, I feel our fetish is safe for another 3 centuries. The bust, too. The precious bust at the Stratford Church. The calm bust. The priceless bust. The emotionless bust. With the dandy mustache and the putty face, unseamed of care. That face which has looked dispassionately down on the awed pilgrim for 150 years and will continue to look down on the awed pilgrim for another 150 years, with the deep, 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 subtle expression of a bladder. One of the most trying defects about these surmisers, these, what shall I call them? For I will not use injurious epithets on them. Such violations of courtesy being repugnant to my nature and my dignity. No, sir. No, the furthest I'll go in that direction is to call them names of limited reverence. Names merely descriptive. Never unkind, never offensive, never tainted with a harsh feeling. If they would do like this, they'd feel better in their hearts. Let me get another amen. Amen. We're back to Sunday school. But now, one of the most trying defects which I find in these Stratfordolaters, these Shakespeareoids, these thugs, these Bangalores, these troglodytes, these harumphrodite, these blatherskites, is their spirit of irreverence. It's detectable in every utterance they make when they're talking about us. I'm thankful that in me there's nothing of that kind of spirit. No, when I think something is sacred, it's impossible for me to be irreverent about it. I cannot recall a single instance when I've ever been irreverent. Except when referring to things other people think are sacred. But now what aggravates me about these troglodytes, these Muscovites, these bandoliers, these buccaneers, is that they made up the whole story by inference, with nothing to infer from. That is, these thugs presume it on no evidence of any kind, which is their way when they want historical fact. Fact and presumption are in their line of business all the same to them. Oh, they know the difference. But they also know how to wink it. And they also know that it doesn't take a presumption long to bloom into a fact when they have the handling of it. Oh yeah, they know from long experience that when they get a hold of a presumption tadpole, he won't stay a tadpole in their history tank, but they'll develop him into a giant four-legged bullfrog of fact and get him to sit up on his hams and puff out his chin and look important and imposing and come to stay and assert his genuine Simon pure authenticity with a thundering bellow that will convince everybody because it is so loud and so often repeated. Just like our politicians. I'll take that as another amen. They presume that the lad severed his presumed connection to the Stratford school. They presume that he became an apprentice to a butcher. They don't know. If it would help their case any, they would presume that he apprenticed 30 butchers or 50 butchers, a wilderness of butchers, all by their patented method, presumption. If it would help their case any, they'd presume that all those butchers were his father. And then next week they'd publish it. That's just like being the past tense of a compound, reflexive, adverbial, incandescent, hypodermic, irreducible, accusation, noun, a multitude. I told you I studied English. Isn't it odd, when you think about it, that you can list all of the celebrated Englishmen, Irishmen, Scotchmen, Germans, Italians, Frenchmen, Russians, going back centuries. And you can go to the histories and the biographies and the encyclopedias and learn the particulars of their lives, of every one of them. All the celebrated ecclesiastics, all the tragedians and comedians and singers and dancers and orators, judges, lawyers, poets, dramatists, historians, biographers, editors, inventors, reformers, statesmen, generals, admirals, discoverers, prize fighters, murderers, pirates, conspirators, misers, swindlers, explorers, adventurers on land and sea, bankers and financiers, astronomers and naturalists, claimants and imposters, chemists, biologists, geologists, philologists, college presidents and professors, architects, engineers, painters, sculptors, politicians, agitators, rebels, revolutionaries, patriots, demagogues, clowns, cooks, freaks, philosophers, burglars, highwaymen, journalists, physicians, surgeons. You can find the life histories of every one of them but one. Just one. The most extraordinary and the most celebrated of them all. By far and away the most colossal prodigy among the whole collection of them. Shakespeare. About him you can find out nothing. Nothing of the slightest importance. Nothing worth stowing away in your memory. Okay, so she was 8 years older than he was. Nothing that even remotely indicates that he was ever anything but a distinctly commonplace person. A manager. An actor of inferior grade. A trader of grain in a small village that did not regard him as a person of any consequence and forgot all about him before he was cold in his grave. We can go back in the records and look up the life histories of every renowned racehorse. But not Shakespeare. The reason is he hadn't any history to record. There's no getting around that deadly fact. And no sane way has been discovered of how to get around the formidable significance of it. Its quite plain significance is, to anybody but those thugs, I don't use the term unkindly, is that Shakespeare had no prominence while he lived. And none until he'd been dead for 2 or 3 generations. The plays enjoyed high success and fame. Everybody loved the plays and the poems for decades, centuries. And if he wrote them, it's a shame the world never found out about it. He should have said, hey, I did this. Shakespeare, you misspelled it. I'm the author, and not a nom de plume, a pen name for another man to hide behind. Who did write these works? I wish I knew. There's been only one Shakespeare. There couldn't be 2. Certainly there couldn't be 2 at the same time. This one was not matched before his time or during his time, and hasn't been matched since. And the prospects of his being matched in our time is not bright. And on his tomb, he could have written this: the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like an insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. And our little life is rounded by a sleep. Instead, he wrote this: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be ye man that spares my stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Arr. When a person reads these noble verses about the cloud-capped towers, he ought not follow it up with "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear." Because the transition from great poetry to poor doggerel will be too violent for comfort. It'll give him a shock. You never know how commonplace and unpoetic gravel is until you bite into a layer of it in a pie. If he had been less intemperately solicitous about his bones and more solicitous about his works, it would have been better for his good name and a kindness to us. Then we wouldn't have this mystery. His bones were not important. They will molder away. They will turn to dust. But the works, whoever wrote them, will endure until the last sun goes down.